You have a working theory about human nature, and it is probably darker than the evidence of your own experience actually warrants. Not cynical exactly, realistic, you would say. The realism that has accumulated through enough disappointments, enough betrayals, enough encounters with the specific ways that people behave when their interests conflict with yours. The realism of a person who has learned to expect less in order to be surprised less, who has organized their approach to people around a defensive estimate of what people are, and who has found that estimate, often enough, confirmed. This theory costs you something you may not have fully named. It costs you the kind of openness that genuine encounter requires, the willingness to be wrong about the person in front of you, the specific generosity of interpretation that sees potential where the defensive estimate sees liability, the quality of attention that treats the other person as someone who might surprise you rather than someone who will eventually confirm what you already expect. Mencius, the 4th century BC Confucian philosopher, who is the most important transmitter and developer of the Confucian tradition in the generation after Confucius himself, said your defensive estimate is wrong. Not naively wrong, philosophically wrong. He spent his life building the most comprehensive argument for the genuine goodness of human nature in the history of Chinese philosophy. And his argument is not wishful thinking. It is grounded in the same careful observation of human behavior that your own pessimism is grounded in, and it reaches a different conclusion. There is a specific closing that happens to the heart over time. Not traumatic, not a single betrayal that produced the decision to trust less. The gradual, cumulative, entirely understandable process by which the open heart of the earlier years becomes the managed heart of the middle years. The specific, quiet contractions that follow each disappointment. The careful calibrations of investment, emotional, relational, moral, that have accumulated into the practiced distance of a person who knows better now than they did when they were more open. The culture calls this wisdom, growing out of naivety, developing the thick skin that adult life requires. And there is something in this that is genuinely valuable. The person who has learned nothing from the disappointments is not wise either. But Mencius looked at this process and said, you have learned the wrong lesson. Not from the disappointments. From the disappointments, something important can be learned. From the contraction, from the closing of the heart that has decided the disappointments are evidence about human nature rather than evidence about specific circumstances. The heart that has concluded from the specific betrayals of specific people in specific conditions that human beings are fundamentally unreliable, fundamentally self-interested, fundamentally not what they appear to be in their better moments. He said the better moments are what people actually are. The betrayals and the self-interest and the moral failures are what happens when the natural goodness is obstructed by circumstances, by habit, by the specific conditions that prevent the genuine nature from expressing itself. The mountain in drought is bare, but the mountain is not essentially bare. It is essentially a mountain that grows trees. Cut down the trees, graze the animals, expose the soil to the sun and rain without protection, and the mountain looks permanently denuded. But cultivate the right conditions and the growth returns, because the capacity was always present underneath the apparent desolation. You are the mountain. The goodness is the nature. The apparent desolation is the condition, and the two are not the same thing. Mencius, Mengzi in Chinese, Master Meng, was born around 372 BC in the state of Zhou in what is now Shandong province, not far from the birthplace of Confucius. He studied, according to tradition, with the disciples of Confucius's grandson Zisi. He became the most important transmitter and developer of the Confucian tradition in the generation after Confucius. Like Confucius, he traveled from state to state, offering his philosophical and political counsel to the rulers of the Warring States period.
the turbulent, violent, politically fragmented era in which the ideals of benevolent governance seemed, to most practical observers, entirely remote from the actual conditions of Chinese political life. Like Confucius, he was largely unsuccessful in finding a ruler willing to implement his vision. Unlike Confucius, whose primary surviving work is the brief, fragmentary Analects, Mencius left behind a substantial text, the Mencius, 7 books of extended philosophical conversations and arguments that preserves his thinking in considerable detail. He debated vigorously with the other philosophical schools of his time, against the Moists, who argued for universal love organized around utility, against the Yanghists, who argued for the priority of individual self-interest, against the fatalists, who argued that circumstances determine outcomes regardless of moral effort. In each debate, he defended the same core position, that human nature is good, that moral cultivation is therefore possible, that benevolent governance is therefore achievable, and that the cynicism that treats these as naive is itself the primary obstacle to their realization. He died around 289 BC. His text became in the Song dynasty one of the 4 books, the core texts of Confucian education, alongside the Analects, the Great Learning, and the Doctrine of the Mean, and remained at the center of Chinese intellectual and political life until the 20th century. The philosophy. 2 arguments that constitute the Mencian case for the genuine goodness of human nature. The first is the thought experiment that has become one of the most famous moments in Chinese philosophy. Mencius says, suppose you see a child about to fall into a well. What do you feel? Not what do you think you should feel, what do you actually feel? You feel alarm and distress, immediately, spontaneously, before any calculation of interest or social expectation. The feeling arrives before the reasoning. And what is that feeling? It is the beginning of Ren, humaneness, the Confucian cardinal virtue. It is the sprout of the genuine moral nature emerging, spontaneously and without instruction, in response to another person's vulnerability. This is the argument, not that people are always good, not that people always act on the sprout of Ren, but that the sprout is present, that the immediate, uncalculated, entirely real response to another person's suffering, the distress you feel before you decide to be distressed, is the evidence of a moral nature that is genuinely, structurally, constitutively present in every human being, not acquired through education, present from the beginning as the natural endowment of the human heart. He identifies 4 sprouts, the beginnings of the 4 cardinal Confucian virtues. The distress at another's suffering is the sprout of Ren, humaneness. The shame at one's own moral failure is the sprout of Yi, righteousness. The deference to others is the Li, ritual propriety. The ability to approve and disapprove is the Ji, wisdom. These 4 sprouts are present in every human being, without exception. They are the evidence of the genuine goodness of human nature. And the moral life, the cultivation of the virtues, is not the imposition of something foreign on a resistant nature. It is the development of what is already present. The second argument is the mountain without trees, the image of the denuded landscape as the image of the person whose natural goodness has been obscured by conditions. Mencius is explicit. When you see a person whose moral nature seems absent, you are seeing the result of conditions, not the evidence of an essentially bad nature. The circumstances of poverty and deprivation and social pressure and bad habit and unchosen environment have done to the person what the woodcutters and the grazing animals and the bare sun have done to the mountain. They have stripped the growth. But the capacity for growth remains, as it remains in the mountain, and the cultivation of the right conditions will allow it to return. This is the most demanding part of the Mencian philosophy because it requires a quality of interpretation about others and oneself that the defensive estimate keeps preventing. The person whose behavior confirms the pessimistic estimate is, in Mencius's framework, a person whose natural goodness has been covered by conditions. The appropriate response is not the confirmation of the estimate. It is the examination of the conditions and the cultivation of the alternatives that allow the natural goodness to express itself. Now the bridge. Because Mencius was a 4th century BC Chinese Confucian philosopher arguing within the context of warring states' political philosophy, and most people watching this video are not.
But here is what translates directly. The person about whom you have a settled, defensive, pessimistic estimate, the colleague, the family member, the public figure, the category of people whose behavior has confirmed often enough that the pessimistic reading is the realistic one. And the question Mencius is asking, is what you are observing the evidence of a genuinely bad nature, or is it the evidence of conditions, of the specific, identifiable, often partially remediable circumstances that have covered the natural goodness with the denuded landscape of the obstructed life? And the inward application? The moment when your own natural goodness seems absent, when the distress at another's suffering fails to arrive, when the shame at your own moral failure has been managed into numbness, when the sprouts of the virtues have been covered so thoroughly by the conditions of the exhausted, defended, self-protective life that you can barely find them. Mencius says, the sprouts are still there. The mountain still has its nature. The cultivation of the right conditions, friendship, rest, genuine attention to the interior life, the removal of what has been covering the natural growth, will allow them to emerge again. This is not the command to be endlessly open in a world that will exploit the openness. It is the philosophical case for a different quality of interpretation, for the specific, evidence-based, carefully argued willingness to see the natural goodness as the nature and the obstruction as the condition, rather than the other way around. Here is what Mencius asks of you, practically, today. First, notice the sprout. The next time the immediate, uncalculated, before-the-reasoning response to another person's situation arrives, the distress at their suffering, the satisfaction at their flourishing, the shame at your own moral failure, receive it as evidence, not as a feeling to be managed or overridden or explained by evolutionary psychology, as the sprout of the natural goodness that Mencius says is the most honest evidence available about what human beings actually are. Most people have been trained to distrust this evidence, to treat the immediate moral response as naive and the calculated response as realistic. Mencius's argument is the opposite. The immediate response is closer to the truth. The calculation that overrides it is where the distortion enters. Second, revise one pessimistic estimate. Take one person about whom you have a settled, defensive, pessimistic reading and apply the mentioned framework, not to excuse the behavior that produced the estimate, to examine whether the behavior is evidence of a genuinely bad nature or evidence of specific conditions that have covered the natural goodness. What are the conditions? What is the specific obstruction that is producing the behavior you have been reading as evidence of nature? This revision does not require you to trust the person uncritically or expose yourself to what the conditions have produced. It requires the philosophical generosity of the Mencian framework, the willingness to see the mountain under the desolation rather than the desolation as the mountain. Third, cultivate one condition that allows growth. In your own life, identify one condition that has been covering the natural goodness, the specific exhaustion, the relationship, the habit, the environment that has been producing the denuded landscape, and take one step toward cultivating the alternative, not the grand transformation, the Mencian cultivation of small but genuine improvements in the conditions that allow the natural growth to return.
In a relationship, identify one thing you could do that would change the conditions for the other person, that would remove one obstruction to the natural goodness that Mencius says is present even in the person whose behavior confirms the pessimistic estimate. Fourth, develop the sprouts through practice. The four sprouts do not develop automatically. They are present as beginnings, as the capacity for the virtues, rather than the virtues themselves. The development requires cultivation, not the imposition of something foreign, but the sustained, daily available practice of acting from the sprout, acting from the distress rather than the calculation, acting from the shame rather than the defense, acting from the deference rather than the competitive positioning. Find one situation today in which the sprout is present and the calculated response is overriding it, and choose once to act from the sprout, not because it's comfortable, because it is what the genuine nature is reaching for, and the practice of acting from it is the cultivation that makes the nature more fully available tomorrow than it is today. I want to close with the image that Mencius returns to again and again in the text, and that is, in its simplicity, the whole of the philosophy. The sprout, the tiny, tender, barely visible emergence of the plant from the soil, the thing that can be crushed in an instant, that requires care and the right conditions, that gives no sign of its extraordinary potential in its earliest form.
He says, if you see a sprout of grain and pull it up to help it grow faster, you will kill it. The cultivation is not forcing, it is removing the obstructions. It is providing the water and the sun and the protection from the things that crush the natural growth. It is trusting that the nature is present, that the capacity for development is genuine, that the patient and careful cultivation of the right conditions will produce what the forcing and the impatience and the premature pulling up will destroy. The goodness in you is the sprout. The goodness in the people around you is the sprout. Present, vulnerable, requiring conditions, capable with the right cultivation of producing the full growth that the nature intends. Mencius spent his life arguing that the world had forgotten this, had looked at the denuded mountain and concluded it was essentially bare, had looked at the crushed sprout and concluded the seed had no potential, had developed a working theory of human nature from the evidence of the obstructions rather than from the evidence of the underlying capacity. He was not asking for naivety. He was asking for the specific, philosophically serious, carefully argued refusal to mistake the condition for the nature, to see, beneath the evidence of what circumstances have produced, the evidence of what the nature actually is. The sprout is still there. The mountain still has its character. The goodness is the nature, not the exception. Here is the question Mencius leaves us with today. Think of the person, or the part of yourself, about whom your current working theory is most pessimistic, where the evidence has accumulated into a settled, defensive estimate of what they are or what you are capable of. And ask the mentioned question, is this the nature, or is this the condition covering the nature? What are the specific, identifiable circumstances that have produced the denuded landscape? And what would cultivation, the removal of one obstruction, the provision of one right condition, allow to emerge? Leave that in the comments, because naming the obstruction rather than the nature is the beginning of the mentioned practice, the practice that said 4 centuries before the Common Era what most of the world's wisest traditions have eventually also said. The goodness is there. It is covered. The work is the uncovering. I'll see you in the next one.